Snow whispered against the cabin walls, soft as breath, steady as prayer. The night outside was white and unending, the kind that swallowed tracks and memories whole. Inside, Clara May Whitfield sat by her iron stove, her fingers stitched with small burns from the wood she fed it. The wind moaned across the plains, slipping through every crack of the old timbers, and she listened the way lonely people do, half hoping it would turn into a voice she knew. The cabin was her world now. 4 walls, a roof patched with tin, and a life reduced to small rituals. Mend, feed the fire, whisper goodnight to no one. She had been alone for 5 winters. Long enough for the gossip to fade from cruel laughter to pity. Long enough that her name was now spoken only when the mail carrier saw smoke rise from her chimney and muttered, "The ghost widow's still breathing." Once, she'd had a husband named Amos. A ranch hand with quick temper and quicker fists. He'd gone out one storm to find her medicine, and the snow took him before dawn. The town said it was God's justice. Clara said nothing. She'd buried him herself, breaking the earth with her hands till her nails split. Since then, she hadn't left the ridge above Bitter Creek. The winters became her company. Cold, predictable, and honest. That night, she felt the cold seeping stronger, the wind beating against the door like a warning. She rose to latch it tighter, and that's when she heard it. 3 knocks. Slow. Heavy. Each one shaking the wood like the hand of something human and desperate. Her breath caught. No one came this far up the ridge. Not in winter, not in the dark. She reached for the rifle above the door. It felt too heavy for her thin arms, but she held it steady as the latch turned again. Another knock, this one lower, more insistent. The storm outside wailed, filling the silence between beats of her heart. "Who's there?" she called, voice rough with disuse. No answer. Only the sound of snow shifting under boots. She cracked the door open just an inch, lantern raised. The wind clawed its way inside, scattering embers across the floor. Through the veil of snow, 3 figures stood. 2 tall men leading horses, their silhouettes broad and still, and between them an older man leaning on a stick, head bowed against the cold. They weren't townsmen. Their skin caught the lamplight with bronze warmth, their hair long and wet against their shoulders. One of them lifted his head, eyes catching hers, dark, steady, unafraid. "Storm caught us," he said, voice deep as the mountains. "We'll go when it passes." She froze. Apache. Her heart stumbled in her chest. Every tale the town told, raiders, theft, revenge, flared through her mind. Yet the old man swayed where he stood, his breath visible in ragged clouds. She hesitated, torn between fear and the ghost of compassion that had not yet died in her. Then she opened the door wider. "You can stable the horses out back," she said, voice shaking. "The barn's half standing, but it'll do." The older man's eyes lifted, lined with exhaustion but soft with gratitude. The twins exchanged a glance, silent language between brothers, and led their horses toward the barn. Clara shut the door and leaned against it, her pulse loud as thunder in her ears. When they came inside, snow clung to their hair and lashes. The taller of the 2, she would later learn his name was Tejo, set down his saddle and glanced at her rifle by the door. "You can leave it," he said quietly. "We won't take more than warmth." The other, Sahel, smiled faintly, his teeth bright in the lamplight. "Unless you've got coffee," he murmured, and she almost laughed, almost. They settled by the fire, the old man wrapped in a wool blanket she fetched from her chest. She poured water from the kettle, her hands trembling as she set tin cups before them. No one spoke for a long time, and the silence became almost holy. The old man, Nantan, lifted his gaze toward the fire. "You live alone, daughter?" he asked, his English touched by rhythm, not accent. She nodded. "And yet you let strangers in from the storm." His eyes softened. "The wind brought us here for a reason." She didn't answer, only pulled her shawl tighter. But something in his tone, neither praise nor curiosity, unsettled her. She had not heard a voice call her daughter in years. Outside, the wind screamed again. The cabin shuddered. Snow slipped through a crack in the window and landed on the hearth, hissing into nothing. Clara rose, trying to wedge the latch closed, but the metal had bent. Before she could fetch a nail, Teho was beside her. He took the latch from her hand, wordless, and with a small hammer and steady patience, repaired it in silence. His hands were scarred, his movements deliberate, almost tender. She watched him, the way his breath fogged faintly in the chill, the way he didn't look at her even once. When he stepped back, the window was sealed tight again. "Thank you," she said quietly. He gave a single nod, eyes returning to the snow beyond the glass. "A storm breaks what's weak," he said, "and shows what's strong enough to hold." Something inside her trembled at that. She didn't know if he meant her door, or her heart. Hours passed. The fire dimmed. The three of them dozed near the warmth, while Clara sat awake, unable to close her eyes. The sound of their breathing, steady, calm, filled the silence that had haunted her for years. She studied their faces in the flicker of light. The father's lined with age and kindness, one son's fierce even in sleep, the other's peaceful. And in that quiet, she realized how long it had been since she had seen another soul rest beneath her roof. When she finally lay down on her cot, the snow outside had thickened to a pale wall. The storm wouldn't pass by morning, she knew. But she didn't dread it. For the first time in years, the night felt alive. She dreamed of her younger self standing by the same window, waiting for Amos to return. But when the door opened in the dream, it wasn't Amos, only three shapes against the white, carrying warmth instead of pain. She woke with tears she hadn't meant to shed. At dawn, the world was buried in silence. The snow lay deep against the door, glittering like powdered glass. She rose, wrapped herself in her shawl, and opened the stove to stir the coals. Behind her, she heard the creak of the floorboards. Teho rising quietly, his bare feet soundless against the wood. "You don't sleep much," he said, voice low. "Not since the storm that took him," she replied before thinking. Then, realizing she'd said too much, she turned away. He didn't press. Only added another log to the fire. Outside, the sky blushed faintly gold behind the veil of snow. The light touched his face, revealing a faint scar along his jaw, a small detail she hadn't noticed before. He caught her looking, and she turned quickly, pretending to busy herself with the kettle. The father stirred, murmuring a prayer in Apache. Sahel yawned and stretched, grinning at his brother. "She's fed us, kept us warm. Maybe the storm's blessing us after all." Teho's gaze flickered toward her again, unreadable. Clara smiled faintly, though she tried to hide it. She poured water into the pot, the smell of coffee filling the room. For a moment, it almost felt like family, like the house itself had remembered how to breathe. But before peace could settle, the sound of distant hoofbeats broke the stillness. The three men tensed instantly, glancing toward the window. Through the white blur of snow, dark shapes were moving, riders, heading up the ridge. Clara's hand froze on the kettle handle. She knew that rhythm, that direction. The town's patrol. They must have seen the tracks last night. Her pulse quickened. She looked at the three guests by her fire, men the town feared and whispered about, and realized what her charity might cost her. Teho stepped to the door, watching the advancing riders through the snow's veil. His shoulders squared, silent and calm. Then he turned to her. "Do you want us to leave?" he asked. The words struck like thunder in the quiet. The fire cracked, the kettle hissed, and outside the hoofbeats grew louder. She looked from him to the door, to the storm that would swallow them alive, and felt the choice rise in her chest, heavy and clear. When she spoke, her voice trembled but didn't break. "No," she whispered. "Not in this storm." Teho's eyes met hers for a long heartbeat, something like respect, something like promise. Then he turned back toward the snow, and the world held its breath. Morning arrived in a hush of silver light, the kind that turns the world soft before the sun sharpens its edges. The storm had quieted, but the ridge lay buried beneath a white hush so deep it seemed sacred. Clara stirred the ashes in the stove and fed it with new logs, her breath fogging in the chill. Behind her the cabin stirred, the quiet shuffle of moccasins, a low murmur in Apache, and the deep timbre of men waking to another hard day. Teho stepped into the light first. His hair was loose, falling dark and damp over his shoulders. He'd removed his coat to hang it by the fire, leaving his chest bare, lean muscle marked with faint scars and beads strung on leather. Clara looked away quickly, the sight stirring something unfamiliar in her ribs. She busied herself with pouring water into the kettle. "There's porridge," she said softly. "If you don't mind it plain." Sahel smiled easily. "Plain is a feast in snow," he said, the warmth of his grin breaking the room's stillness. Their father, Nantan, sat quietly at the table, his posture regal despite the wear of travel. When he looked at Clara, it was as though he saw more than her face. He saw the loneliness tucked behind every motion. "You rise early," he said, "as do those who carry the world alone." She met his gaze, unsure whether to bow or speak. "I've carried only what's left," she answered. He nodded once, as if her truth required no correction. They ate in silence, spoons tapping gently against tin bowls. Snowlight poured through the small window, catching the dust motes like drifting ash. For the first time in years, Clara's kitchen was full of sound, the small rhythm of living. It startled her how much she'd missed it. After breakfast, the twins stepped outside to clear the snow from the roof and split wood. She watched through the window as they worked in easy rhythm, axes biting into frozen logs, steam rising from their bare skin. There was no wasted motion, no speaking, just the harmony of effort. The sight filled her chest with quiet heat. Once, Amos had chopped wood in that same yard. He'd cursed every swing. These men moved like the work itself was a prayer. By noon, the storm's remnants began to melt. She stepped out with a shawl around her shoulders, watching Tejo repair the broken fence post near the barn. He looked up when he heard her boots crunch the snow. "You shouldn't work so long in this cold," she said. He shrugged, driving the last nail in with measured grace. "The cold reminds us we're alive." His voice was low, not boastful, almost meditative. She hesitated, then handed him a mug of coffee. "You'll need this more than philosophy." His lips almost curved, almost. He took it with a nod. For a heartbeat, their fingers brushed, and she felt the rough warmth of his hand before he pulled away. Her heart stuttered, not from fear this time, but from something that made her feel foolishly young again. Sahel joined them soon, his easy laugh chasing away the stillness. "He works, I talk," he said. "That's how we balance the world." Tejo grunted. "You talk. I fix." Clara smiled faintly. It had been years since humor lived within her walls. Nantan watched from the doorway, his eyes distant but kind. "A home remembers kindness," he said in his native tongue, and though she didn't understand the words, she felt their meaning like warmth against her skin. Later that afternoon, the quiet was broken by the sound of distant hoofbeats. The mail rider, a lean red-bearded man, paused near the fence, staring at the horses tied in her yard. His gaze darted from her to the men. "You got company," he said slowly, suspicion thick in his tone. "Didn't figure you for keeping such." "They're travelers," she answered evenly. "Caught by the storm." He spat into the snow. "Travelers, sure. You be careful, Miss Whitfield. Folks in town see Apache tracks, they don't ask questions before lighting torches." His horse pawed the snow restlessly as he turned to leave. "Don't let your kindness ruin your safety." When he disappeared down the trail, silence returned, but a different kind, tight, watchful. Sahel's jaw clenched. "He'll talk," he muttered. "They always do." Tejo looked toward her, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be in danger for us." Clara crossed her arms, the wind catching the edge of her shawl. "You didn't ask to be here. And I didn't ask the world's permission to help you." For a moment, no one spoke. The snow glittered in sunlight like scattered glass. Then Nantan smiled faintly, pride and sorrow mingling in his weathered face. "A brave woman carries storms without bending," he said softly. That night, Clara cooked stew with the last of her potatoes and dried venison. The smell filled the small cabin, and for a while they ate in peace. Nantan spoke of the land they'd come from, the canyons, the herds, the rivers frozen with stars. Sahel laughed at his own stories, gesturing wide with his spoon. Tejo listened mostly, though once or twice his gaze met hers across the fire. There was something there, quiet but certain, like a word unsaid because it was already understood. As the firelight flickered, Nanton's eyes closed briefly. "The snow took more from us than cattle," he said. "It took names, songs, women. We wandered to remember." Clara's throat tightened. "It took my husband," she whispered. "But not my will to survive." Tejo lifted his gaze to her, the fire painting his face in amber and shadow. "Then you have the strength of the mountains," he said simply. Outside, the wind began again, softer this time. It rattled the eaves like fingers on glass. Inside, warmth gathered between them, fragile and unspoken. Hours passed. The fire dimmed to coals. Clara sat by the hearth, darning a sleeve, when Sahel broke the silence. "Your people," he said. "They'll come?" She looked up slowly. "They'll talk first. Then they'll come." "Then we'll go before that," Tejo said. "We bring no harm." But Nantan opened his eyes. "Not yet," he murmured. "The storm still owns the trail." Tejo hesitated, then nodded. His word was law to his father, and Clara sensed the quiet bond between them, a kind of faith she'd never known with Amos. When she stood to fetch more wood, Tejo rose too, crossing to the window. He peered through the frost, his breath fogging the glass. "They'll come by morning," he said softly. "I've seen fear travel faster than snow." She met his reflection in the glass, their faces faintly blurred by the frost. "Then we'll meet it together." He turned slightly, studying her as if the words carried more weight than she realized. Then he inclined his head once. "Together," he echoed. The room fell silent again. Only the fire spoke, crackling low, its light washing her face in gold. She thought of how long it had been since she'd felt another person's nearness without dread. The fear that once lived inside her had begun to shift, melting, slow as spring thaw. Outside, somewhere far below the ridge, the distant echo of voices carried up the trail. Men's voices. Too many to mistake for the wind. Tejo stepped closer to the door, hand resting near his knife. Sahel's grin faded. Clara rose from her chair, her pulse quickening. The firelight trembled across the walls. "Visitors again," Sahel murmured. Tejo looked back at Clara, eyes calm but fierce beneath the flicker. "Stay inside. Whatever happens, stay." But she shook her head slowly, heart steady now. "It's my house. My storm." Nanton's voice drifted from the shadows, gentle, certain. "Then stand with your truth, daughter of snow." And as the hoofbeats drew nearer, Clara felt her fear harden into something else entirely, resolve shining like steel beneath the frost. The snow had turned to ice by the time the riders reached her ridge. Their horses snorted clouds into the frozen air, hooves cracking through crusted white. Clara stood by the door, shawl drawn tight, the twins behind her like silent sentinels. The fire inside cast a faint amber glow through the frosted glass, and beyond that warmth, three shadows on horseback, rifles slung, faces hard with self-righteous fear. "Miss Whitfield," the lead man called, his voice slicing through the wind. "Step outside. We'd like a word." She didn't move. The sound of her name from his mouth, Jacob Hall, the storekeeper, made something old and bitter stir in her chest. He was the kind who'd smiled at her once, before her husband's death, and spat at her afterward. Now he raised his chin, his hat dusted with frost, and she saw in his posture the whole town's judgment taking form. Tejo's hand brushed her shoulder, steady and wordless. "You don't have to," he murmured. "Yes," she whispered. "I do." She stepped outside. The wind bit her cheeks raw, but she held herself tall. "You're early for gossip, Jacob," she said, voice even. The storm's barely cleared. Jacob's mouth twitched. "Ain't gossip if half the town saw Apache horses outside your cabin. Folks are worried. We don't take kindly to trouble hiding this close." Sahel shifted behind her, his shadow cutting long across the snow. "Trouble," he said softly, "wears many faces." His tone wasn't angry, just true. It made the men's horses fidget. Jacob's companion, a younger man with a scar across his lip, lifted his rifle an inch. "You threatening us, Injun?" Tejo stepped forward, calm as the frozen creek below. He stated a fact, he said. His voice carried weight, the kind that didn't need to rise to be heard. Jacob spat into the snow. We don't want blood. We just want him gone. You can come back to town, Clara. You'll be safe. Clara looked from him to the men behind her. Safe? She repeated. In town, where my name's a curse. Where you all whispered that my husband froze because I was cursed myself. Her voice cracked but didn't break. No, Jacob. I'm safer among strangers than I ever was among neighbors. The younger man's rifle cocked, the sound sharp as breaking ice. Sahel's hand went to his knife in the same breath, and for a heartbeat, the air froze with tension, one twitch away from violence. Then Nanton's voice came from the doorway, calm as snowfall. If men seek peace, they should not knock with guns. His English was measured, his gaze unwavering. The old man's dignity silenced them more effectively than any weapon. Even Jacob hesitated, lowering his arm. We just want to make sure she ain't being forced, Jacob said, tone softening under the elder's steady eyes. If she's staying, it's her choice. Clara took one step forward. It is. Her voice carried against the wind, firm as the ridge beneath her feet. Now go. Jacob looked at her for a long moment, the weight of pride and something like pity in his stare. Then he turned his horse, muttering to his men. Fine. But you've chosen your company, Clara. Don't expect the town to come running when it turns on you. The hoofbeats faded into the valley, swallowed by the snow. For a while, no one spoke. The wind returned to its lonely howl, carrying away the sound of threat but not its shadow. Inside, the fire had burned low. Clara shut the door behind her and leaned against it, trembling only when the latch clicked. Tejo watched her, his dark eyes steady, unreadable. You didn't have to stand between us, he said quietly. Their fear isn't yours. It is, she whispered. If I don't stand now, I'll spend the rest of my life kneeling to ghosts. Something softened in his face, respect, maybe, or sorrow. He nodded once and said no more. They ate that evening in near silence. Sahel stared into the flames, restless. They'll be back, he said. Men like that always return with more. Nantan warmed his hands near the hearth. Let them, he murmured. Truth has to meet its enemy before it becomes wisdom. Tejo rose and went to the window, peering through the frost. If they come again, we'll leave before dawn. Clara looked up sharply. You'll freeze out there. We've walked colder trails, he said, but there was no arrogance in it, just resignation. This place isn't ours to endanger. She stood slowly, crossing to him. Maybe it isn't yours, she said, but it's mine, and I won't have it emptied by fear again. Their eyes met, firelight flickering between them like a fragile truce. He exhaled through his nose, the faintest ghost of a smile tugging at his mouth. You're stubborn. You're alive because of it. Outside, the wind changed direction, rattling the shutters like bones. The smell of snow was sharper, storm returning. They worked together to shutter the windows and feed the fire. When the chores were done, Tejo sat near the door, knife in hand, carving wood in silence. Each motion was calm, precise, the rhythm steadying her heart. Sahel leaned close to her as he passed, voice low and teasing. He carves when he's thinking too much. Usually about what scares him. She smiled faintly. And what scares him now? Maybe not what, Sahel said, his eyes glinting. But who? She looked away, cheeks warming. Nantan chuckled softly, the sound like dry leaves. Even warriors fear what they cannot fight, he said. And kindness is sharper than steel. Later, when the others slept, Clara remained awake, listening to the wind's lullaby, and the steady rhythm of Tejo's breathing near the fire. She realized the fear she'd once felt, the instinct to bolt, to mistrust, had changed shape. What replaced it wasn't comfort, but a strange peace born from recognition. They, too, were exiles. Different tongue, same silence. In the deep hours of night, she rose and opened the door a crack. Snow drifted in like starlight. She watched it fall, soft and endless, until Tejo's voice reached her from the shadows. You'll catch cold, he murmured. She turned. His eyes reflected the fire's faint gold, his expression unreadable. "Can't sleep," she said. He rose, stepping beside her. For a moment they stood together, watching the snowfall blur the world to white. "Storm's not done with us yet," he said. She nodded. "Neither's the town." He glanced at her, then back at the horizon. "Storms pass. Fear doesn't. But sometimes it learns your name and leaves you be." The words lingered between them, fragile as the breath they shared in the cold. She thought of all she'd lost, of Amos, of the years that followed, of the silence that had nearly buried her alive, and understood with quiet certainty that something within her had shifted tonight. Not healed, not yet, but begun to thaw. When she turned to go inside, her hand brushed his for the briefest instant. He didn't move away. Neither did she. The firelight caught in his dark hair, in the snow melting on his shoulders. He looked down at her, eyes full of questions he'd never ask. And she, trembling though she didn't understand why, whispered the only truth she had left. "I'm not afraid anymore." He exhaled slowly, as if the words themselves were a gift. "Then the storm's already losing," he said. Outside, far beyond the ridge, a faint echo rolled across the frozen valley. Hooves again, distant but certain. The town's wrath had not yet burned itself out. Tejo's gaze flicked toward the sound, calm hardening to resolve. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we'll see who truly owns the snow." The storm returned that night like a ghost come to finish what it had started. Wind howled across the ridge, flinging snow sideways, and the world shrank to the circle of golden firelight inside the cabin. The horses stamped restlessly in the barn. The shutters rattled like bones. Clara fed the fire, her hands trembling as she set the iron poker down. Behind her, Nantan coughed, a deep weary sound that bent him forward in his chair. Tejo was at his side instantly, one large hand on his father's shoulder. "He's burning," Clara said quietly. "His skin's hot as the stove." "I know." Tejo's voice was calm, but his eyes weren't. "He's been coughing since the storm began. I thought it would pass." Sahel paced near the door, restless as a wolf. "We should move him, get him to the valley." "The trail's gone," Tejo said sharply. "You'd lose him before dawn." Clara fetched a rag and dampened it with melted snow. "We'll keep him warm," she murmured. "That's all we can do tonight." She pressed the cloth against Nantan's forehead, the heat of his skin shocking against her fingertips. His eyes opened faintly, cloudy and tired, and he smiled at her with something like peace. "You're kind," he whispered. "It's been long since my son saw a woman's kindness." Her throat tightened. "You do the same for me." He closed his eyes again, murmuring something in Apache, soft syllables that drifted like prayer. Tejo bowed his head as if listening to a benediction. The storm raged outside, but in that small room, time slowed until only the crackle of fire remained. Hours passed. Nantan's breaths grew shallow, like waves receding from shore. Sahel sat beside him now, silent tears glinting on his cheeks. Tejo knelt at his father's side, his rough hand resting over the old man's heart. Clara sat on the floor near them, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching the life of one world fade quietly into another. When Nantan finally exhaled his last, it was not with struggle but surrender. His hand twitched once beneath Tejo's, then stilled. The fire popped, sending a single spark upward. Tejo bowed his head. Sahel turned away and punched the wall, a dull thud swallowed by the wind. Clara closed her eyes and whispered a prayer she hadn't spoken since her husband's grave. Morning came pale and merciless. The storm had laid the ridge in silence, snow waist-deep against the door. They buried Nantan behind the cabin, where the pine trees met the white horizon. The air was so cold it burned the lungs. The shovels cut into the ground with muted thuds. Clara wrapped her shawl around her face and held the lantern, while the brothers lowered their father into the earth. Tejo knelt in the snow after the last handful of dirt was placed. He didn't cry. He only pressed his palm into the grave and whispered something low, in a tongue that sounded older than the mountains. When he rose, his face looked carved from stone. Sahel wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "He's gone home," he said hoarsely. "We can leave now, brother. Nothing's keeping us." Tejo's gaze drifted toward the cabin. "Something is," he murmured. Clara met his eyes across the snow, her breath ghosting in the cold. She understood without words. That evening, the world seemed hollow. The wind had died, but the silence felt too big for one cabin. Clara cooked what little food was left, stew of beans and snowmelt, and they ate without appetite. When Sahel finally stood, his voice carried a quiet finality. "I'll take the horses. Find a trail south before the next storm." He looked at his brother, then at Clara. "He'd want you to stay warm." Tejo nodded, though his eyes flickered with something unspoken. Sahel gave Clara a faint, broken smile and stepped into the dusk. The sound of hooves faded down the frozen path, until even that was gone. Night came again, calm but heavy. Clara sat near the fire, the light painting her face in amber and shadow. Tejo sat across from her, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his eyes reflecting the flame. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. "You could go with him. You should." He didn't look away from the fire. "And leave you here? Alone again?" "I've been alone before," she whispered. "I know," he said. "That's why I won't let you be again." Her breath caught. "You can't stay. The town." "The town," he interrupted softly, "is wind. It passes." He leaned forward slightly, the firelight catching the planes of his face, the softness beneath the strength. "You opened your door when the world shut ours. You gave my father peace. I didn't do it for thanks." "I know," he said again, a faint smile touching his lips. "That's why it matters." She looked down at her hands, rough from work, trembling now for no reason she could name. "People will talk. Let them." He reached into the pouch around his neck, and drew out a string of small turquoise beads. He turned them in his fingers, the color glowing against his skin. "My mother made this," he said quietly, "for the woman who would carry my heart." She stared at the necklace, her voice caught in her throat. "Tejo." He rose and crossed the room, slow as breath. Standing before her, he took her hand and pressed the beads into her palm. "I don't ask you to wear it tonight. Only to know that when you do, the world will have to understand we built something here no storm could bury." Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. "You'll lose your people for me," she whispered. He shook his head. "I already lost half my soul burying my father. I'd rather give the other half to something worth keeping." The fire cracked between them, heat rising. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. She rose slowly, their hands still joined. The silence between them was deeper than words. Then she stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth of his breath against her cheek. "I don't know how to begin again," she said. "You already have," he murmured. He leaned in, not with urgency but reverence, and kissed her forehead. It was not a claim but a vow, quiet and eternal. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, her heart felt full enough to ache. When she looked up, the fire had softened to a golden glow. He untied his own necklace of leather and beads and looped it around her wrist. "If the town comes," he said, "I'll stand beside you. If they drive us out, we'll build elsewhere. But I will not walk away from what this snow gave me." The wind sighed against the window, gentler now, like blessing. She touched his cheek with trembling fingers. "Then stay." He smiled, the first real one she'd ever seen from him, and it lit his whole face, even the scars. "I thought you'd never ask." They moved together then, slow and certain, as if guided by something older than fear. The storm outside whispered and faded, the fire burned low, and the ridge that had once held only ghosts now held breath, laughter, and the promise of spring. By morning, smoke curled gently from the chimney, and two sets of footprints led from the cabin door to the pine grove where Nantan slept beneath the snow. Beside his grave, a new marker stood. Small, simple, carved with both Apache symbols and English letters. It read only one word: home. As the sun rose over the white horizon, Clara and Tejo stood hand in hand, their faces turned toward the light. The snow shimmered around them like blessing, and for the first time in her life, she felt no chill at all.